Hey, welcome to Pop Culture Graveyard. I am Hollis, and today I want to talk a little bit about jazz. I have felt like a bit of a fraud lately because I come on here and I talk about my favorite punk bands, my favorite post-punk bands, my favorite pop bands, and I never mention jazz. I'll let you in on a little secret. When I'm at home, 80% of the time I listen to jazz. In my collection as a whole, I don't have a ton of jazz. I only got into jazz, like heavily got into jazz, in the past 2 years. Being that I was a DJ for many years, and sometimes I needed a whole album just for one song, there's a lot of fat on my vinyl collection. Being that I only got into jazz a couple of years ago, not true of my jazz collection. All killer, no filler. I picked 10 awesome jazz records. These are not my top 10. They're not the 10 best jazz records. They're just 10 great jazz records that I appreciate and that I think you'll appreciate. I've got live stuff, I've got studio stuff, there's some classics in there, there's some obscurities, and there's something in between. So without further eloquence, here are 10 awesome jazz records. First off, Lee Morgan, Live at the Lighthouse. I love this live album. It's the only live album done during Lee's short lifetime. He died at 33. Like our Lord. The Lighthouse was a club in Hermosa Beach, California. It was recorded in July of 1970, the same year it came out. And I got lucky because up here at the top corner, stamped, almost like Braille, it says, "Not for sale, promotional use only." I think the guy who sold it to me was unaware of that, but that would have driven the price up a little bit. It's an original press. It's in outstanding, pristine condition, and it is a gem of my collection. This might be, and I say might because he's got such a great catalog, but of all the Lee Morgan albums I own, this might be my favorite because there's something about hearing him play live that makes Lee Morgan much more human to me and down to earth and not this mythic figure. This Lee is no longer a young man. He had suffered a beating at the hands of drug dealers, which injured Lee's jaw and left him with a changed embouchure. So Lee had to learn how to play a different way, and he does here. Ironically, the same exact thing happened to Chet Baker, another guy who struggled with substance abuse. So he had to learn how to play a different way. Stay off drugs, kids. But Lee's playing doesn't suffer one bit. In fact, it may have unlocked something new. This was recorded at the Hermosa Beach Club in July of 1970, and after a decade of playing some of the most challenging and enthralling hard bop trumpet anywhere, Lee had grown tired of the style and had already been making his first tentative steps into more challenging modal territory. There are 4 cuts on this album. That's right, a double album with 4 cuts, 1 cut per side, which used to irk me when I'd buy an album. Feel like I was getting ripped off, but now my mouth salivates thinking about all the improvisation that must take place on a double album with only 4 cuts. There's a lot of stretching out. Brilliant album. The tracks were all written by his bandmates here. 2 from the bass player, 1 from the piano player, and 1 from the sax player. This album could be categorized as post-bop, but it's got rare moments that recall the swinging music that made Lee so acclaimed as a teenager. When the opening track of Absolutions kicks in, holy hell, this is exactly what I wanted to hear when I bought this album. The trumpet and sax are so authoritative together and laid down with such gusto. I can't believe they haven't been sampled already on 100 hip-hop tracks. The Beehive is another strong horn workout over a pulsating rhythm track. This unit is unbelievably tight. Disc 2's Nimmo and Neophilia are also great tracks. Trust me when I say, I urge you to download the entire session, which has been available on CD over 3 discs for years. But you can now download the whole thing for $10. It's 13 tracks total, so you're just getting the tip of the iceberg with these 4. But this album sounds amazing, and it's a top 5 live jazz album for me. For vinyl enthusiasts, there was some great news recently. Supposedly all these tracks from the Lighthouse shows are being released next spring, 2021, as the complete Lee Morgan at the Lighthouse. I've heard it'll be anywhere from 10 to 12 all-analog LPs cut by Kevin Gray. When I first heard that, I was like, do they mean 10 to 12 sides? Because this is a lot, but maybe they're doing a 45 RPM version. In any case, I'm sure the price tag will be substantial. Do yourself a favor. Download the whole album now for $10 and get to know all the tracks beforehand and learn whether the vinyl is essential for you or not. But if you should find this anywhere out in the wild, jump. Up next, Soul Fusion, Milt Jackson and the Monty Alexander Trio. It came out in 1978 on Pablo Records. It's got a black and white cover design, as is usual for Pablo. I'm going to make a bold statement. Everything on Pablo is great. There are certain labels you can just trust. It's a trademark of quality. Like everything on Flying Dutchman is good. Everything on Strata East is good. I'm throwing Pablo in there. If it's on Pablo, you know it's good quality. What else would you expect from a label named after Pablo Picasso? That's right. The owner of the label, Norman Granz, who had already owned Verve, befriended Pablo Picasso in 1968 when he was introduced to him by a uranium magnate, which is a very 1968 sentence. Moving on. This album smokes. This may be my favorite Milt Jackson album. I love Milt Jackson. Why do I love Milt Jackson? Because he's got plenty soul. Milt and the great Jamaican-born pianist Monty Alexander played together for the first time back in 1969. This was their third time working together, and their first time on the Pablo label. On the Vibes, there's a short list of greatness. There's Milt Jackson, there's Bobby Hutcherson, and then there's everybody else. Sure, there's Lionel Hampton, there's Cal Tjader, but their material doesn't speak to me, like Milt's and Bobby's. Milt Jackson and Bobby Hutcherson are to Vibes what Kenny Burrell and Grant Green are to guitar. Milt sounds gorgeous on this album. He's especially gorgeous on the Stevie Wonder cover, Isn't She Lovely? The entire band really cooks on the Milt-written numbers, and Monty Alexander's fantastic piano work is all over this album. Yet he doesn't overplay even once. The band at some point touch on every single style, from blues to classical to bossa nova to something you might hear if you wandered into Isaac's bar on the Love Boat. Badass Cool never sounded this accessible. It's a great toe-in-the-water album for the work of Milt Jackson or the work of Monty Alexander, or if you just want to check out what the Pablo label has to offer. So it's a high recommend. Up next, Felonious Monk, Alone in San Francisco. This was a hard pick among all of the Monk albums I have. I liked Felonious Monk back when I didn't like any other jazz, so I got an awful lot of his albums right off the bat when I was getting back into jazz. This is a deep groove OG mono. It sounds phenomenal. I actually have a newer press, which is a Japanese press from the 70s that is in beautiful shape. It's pristine, and it doesn't sound that great. It has crazy surface noise, and it's got a really crappy soundstage. My OG mono is not in pristine shape. It actually looks like someone went out and hammered nails with it, and it plays beautifully. Such is the wacky world of jazz pressings. In any case, this was a tough pick between all the Monk albums I have. I toyed with going no-brainer, Brilliant Corners, and I toyed with going with my favorite Monk album, himself. But in the end, I had to go with Alone. First of all, not a lot of musicians can handle being the only musician. I think Monk and Bill Evans are the only two guys to play solo and to really transcend a guy alone in a room with a piano. Monk's the only musician here. I feel on other Monk albums, such as Live at Town Hall or Live with John Coltrane, or any of his albums playing with other people, the other musicians normalize him somewhat. This album is 100% uncut Monk. What's the street value on that? And that's why I keep coming back to this album over and over and over again. Monk seems to lose himself in the songs. His normal playfulness gives way to introspection, and there's an almost somber tone to the songs here. This album goes perfectly with rainy days. Monk classics such as Blue Monk, Ruby My Dear, and Panonica share space with newer Monk workups like Blue Hawk and Round Lights, as well as pop favorites such as Everything Happens to Me and You Took the Words Right Out of My Heart. It's a very unique album in his canon, and it's one of my favorites. Up next, McCoy Tyner. Time for Tyner. I couldn't resist that voice. People of a certain age will know what I was doing. McCoy Tyner is one of my favorite artists of all time. Picking a McCoy album was tough. I almost went with Expansions because it's brilliant and quite possibly his best work. I almost went with The Real McCoy because it's also brilliant and also quite possibly his best work. But I decided to go with what I felt is McCoy's most underrated album. And that's saying something for his body of work, because I think it's all underrated. So I went with Time for Tyner. I actually have 2 copies of this. This is a United Artists pressing, and I also have a Liberty pressing. The Liberty pressing is from 71, and the United Artists pressing is from 70. And I figured I'll just get both, and whichever one sounds better I'll keep, and I'll sell the other one. They both sound great, and I just couldn't give one up. Whether it's McCoy tracks like May Street, or its standards like Surrey with the Fringe on top, McCoy Tyner does not disappoint. McCoy plays with electricity. I implore you to go track down this album before everyone else in the world knows how great it is and the price skyrockets. They can still be had, they're affordable, and you just need this. You need this in your life. You ever look at your collection and realize you have nothing by Ahmad Jamal? So you go out and you buy everything by Ahmad Jamal? No? Just me? I'm going to focus on 1958's burner of an album, but not for me, Live at the Pershing. Pershing is a hotel in Chicago. This album sold hundreds of thousands of copies, eventually becoming a million seller in the 90s, and it is a beautiful, beautiful record. It's on Argo, which was the main label that Ahmad recorded for in the 50s and 60s, which morphed into Cadet later. Ahmad Jamal is not talked about a great deal when people are throwing down with their favorite jazz artists. Ahmad Jamal made a few career missteps. One, he was popular. People don't like when people are popular. They like the struggling artist. And I think that's why he's not as revered today. Another problem was he didn't write much. He was mainly known as an interpreter of other people's material. That doesn't enhance one's legacy either. However, Ahmad's trio was a cool jazz influence on many jazz stars, including Miles Davis, who no one would accuse of being polite or suffering fools gladly. Through his unerring use of space, the sound Ahmad achieves here is minimalist. Yet at the same time, he sprinkles just enough musical flourishes to embellish the sound. Even given his underplaying, Ahmad is a master of his instrument, and at times he can sound like an orchestra unto himself. He's equally as adept at Gershwin and Rodgers and Hammerstein as he is on more blues and Latin-flavored tracks. Never one to hog the spotlight, but rather to serve the songs, Ahmad continually allows his rhythm section to shine. Side 2 kicks off with his hit, Poinciana, which is one of the main reasons that this album was so popular. By the way, if you don't like Poinciana, you probably won't like Ahmad Jamal, or probably any good music. The final song, What's New, ends with stunned silence by the beauty of the performance, followed by late applause. And I couldn't agree with that audience more. Every single note he hits is perfect. Excellence of execution. Unlike most of the cats on this list, Ahmad Jamal is still with us at the age of 90. So contrary to popular opinion, we didn't lose everyone this year. This is a perfect starting point for your Ahmad Jamal exploration. Up next, Bill Evans, Intuition, with Eddie Gomez. I have a soft spot in my heart for this 1975 album. I was originally going to talk about my Portrait in Jazz pressing that I love so much from Newberry Comics in beautiful blue. But since everyone talks about that album, I wanted to go a little more obscure, hence Intuition. This 1975 album, with Eddie Gomez on bass, his frequent collaborator, is very underrated. When I heard about Bill Evans playing a Fender Rhodes on some of his 70s albums, I was very intrigued. I love the sound of a Fender Rhodes. I know it's somewhat of a divisive instrument when it comes to jazz fans. Some people love it, some people hate it. I happen to love that sound. For the uninitiated, it's basically an electric piano that found favor with a lot of jazz artists, most of them younger, in the mid to late 70s. Ahmad Jamal played one on a great album. In any case, Bill Evans was one of the first to the party on the Fender Rhodes. I wanted to track down one of those albums in which he uses it, and I did. Once I saw that the Shrink Wrap had a Tower Records label, I knew I had to have this one. Evans came to the Fender Rhodes sooner than most, and he first used it on his 1970 album, Left to Right. Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea were two younger players who took the instrument to a higher level in the mid to late 70s. Old school Bill Evans, on the other hand, just saw the instrument as a bit of fun. My favorite track off this is probably Blue Serge, which is a cover of a Duke Ellington tune. Thanks to a Maestro phase shifter, which was left attached to the Fender Rhodes from a previous session, Evans' solos are thick and syrupy, with a strong sustain on his right hand while comping on piano with his left. And that sound is present on the entire album. They were just like, let's go with it. But Blue Serge is really beautiful. Incidentally, a rapper named Declaime sampled this song for his track Caliwayz. But I digress. Evans and Gomez had been together for about 8 years when they made this album, and they have an almost subliminal connection, and it's their uncanny interplay that makes this album a winner. This is also a really super affordable album. Up next, Yusef Latif, live at Pep's. If you own only one Yusef Latif album, let it be this one. Live at Pep's from 1964 features everything Yusef does well. He plays several instruments, including sax, oboe, and flute, as well as a lot of other exotic instruments whose names I can't pronounce. And he rips fiery solos on every one of them. Oftentimes on live albums, there's a dead-ass crowd. Not this one. This crowd is hot as hell, alternating between stunned silence and full-on frenzy for the entire album. Check out number 7, which is actually the second track on the album, for an example of how Yusef and the band have the crowd eating out of their hands. The tracks effortlessly blend the bluesy with the Eastern influenced, and it's the perfect introduction to the great Yusef Latif. By the time the band get to final track Slippin' and Slidin', to which for some reason I can't resist singing the words to the spiritual Wadin' in the Water. God's going to trouble that water. I dare you not to be a Yusef fan. The digital version has since been expanded with bonus tracks, so if you want to hear everything they did that night, get on it. This is the OG mono. It sounds terrific, but I'll bet the stereo sounds just as good. Up next, Ornette Coleman, The Sound of Jazz to Come, recorded in the amazing jazz year of 1959. This is such a killer album. You've no doubt already heard how influential this album is, but that's just it. This is such an amazing album historically that I think it gets overlooked creatively. When I first found this album in a record store about 30 years ago, and picked it up for $16, I walked over to the listening station, and if your record store doesn't have listening stations, I feel bad for you, son. So I brought it over to the store's turntable, put on the headphones, and I listened to about 20 seconds of the first track, Lonely Woman. And I took off my headphones and I walked up and I bought it. I figured if the rest of the songs were even a quarter as good as Lonely Woman, this album would be the best album I own. Obviously, no other track on this album can live up to Lonely Woman. Lonely Woman is a top 10 jazz song for me. However, the older I got, and dare I say the more mature, the more the rest of the album grew on me. Now I love the whole damn thing. And a small part of what I love about this album is that not everybody else is going to love it. You know how you'd get in on the ground floor of a rock band like Nirvana or Soundgarden or Ned's Atomic Dust Bin? I'm old. Get used to it. And before long, everyone else is into that band and it's pretty annoying, and then you start not liking that band a little bit. What's great about jazz is that even with some well-known seminal albums, you can still be one of the few people who get it. Some jazz guys don't even get it. Miles Davis, upon first hearing this album, hated it. He later warmed to Ornette Coleman, but come on. My joints on here are, of course, Lonely Woman, The Underappreciated Piece, and all of side 2. The entire quartet plays as one. So a shout out to Don Cherry on cornet, Charlie Hayden, Daddy of Petra Hayden, on bass, and Billy Higgins on drums. Great, great album. Up next, Pharoah Sanders, Karma. I was originally going to say I unapologetically love this album. I say unapologetically because it's so easy to love this album, I said to myself. Who wouldn't love this album? I only remembered its strong melodicism and almost hypnotic structure, and it made me feel kind of basic. Then I listened to this album for the first time in a while, and this ain't basic. Less chords, more exploration. How does he do it? My wife happened to walk into the room during the middle of the 19-minute, 20-second The Creator Has a Master Plan and said, "This is a weird little tune. Strangulated sax, burbling bass, and flirty flute. You can lose yourself in its sonic textures." With fellow heavy hitters including Ron Carter, Lonnie Liston Smith, Freddie Watts, and of course Leon Thomas on vocals and percussion, Pharoah has made the songs on this album appear to be something they are not. Simple. They're anything but simple, and the complexity is what keeps me coming back. To this day, this spiritual jazz juggernaut is my favorite Pharoah Sanders album, and I love lots of Pharoah Sanders albums. As my mom is wont to say, just taste it. Finally, A Love Supreme. I know this is wildly popular, and I know you already know how great this is. But I have a very practical reason for talking about this album. I'm aware I'm a very old man. And so I got a lot of my pressings years ago. On top of that, I'm a bit of a dead wax geek, and so I search out very specific, unique, obscure pressings. So it's very rare I have something actionable for you regarding a new pressing. However, this pressing from Acoustic Sounds is excellent. If you've ever been on the fence about buying a copy of A Love Supreme, but were worried about finding a worthy pressing, one that sounds really good, or you were afraid of buying something used that was beat up by 10 previous owners, let me assure you this pressing is your best bet, sound-wise, packaging-wise, and bang for the buck-wise, which will make you happy emotion-wise. This pressing is flat, quiet, centered, and clean as hell, with a beautiful sound stage. No matter what kind of system you're playing records on, this will probably sound amazing on it. I myself had been waiting for a good pressing of this masterpiece while I bought all the other Coltrane albums. I was sure it wouldn't be long before there was another great, affordable pressing. I don't have to oversell this one. You no doubt already know it's one of the greatest albums ever made. For me, even the short intro of just John warming up his sax is a thrilling moment, knowing what's about to come. There's not another album like it. All its tracks are transcendent. Acknowledgement is my favorite track when it comes to Coltrane. Resolution is my favorite when it comes to my beloved McCoy Tyner and Jimmy Garrison. Pursuance is my favorite when it comes to Elvin Jones. And I love Psalm for all of them together at once. This is taken from the original analog tapes. It sounds fantastic. Buy the Acoustic Sounds if you can while they're available. That is it. 10 amazing jazz albums. Are you already enjoying some of these albums? Please let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. If you did, please hit the subscribe button and ring the little bell, and I will see you next week with a lot more cool stuff.